Bow and arrow. The stick, string tied on both ends. Pull it back. Shoot another stick. Quite a mystery. Looks real simple when you watch someone else do it. When you go to do it yourself, it's not nearly as simple. If you know the rules, it becomes simple. What we're going to do here is we're going to show you rules. And then we'll make a bow or two. Make them quickly to show you the principles behind it. Once you understand the principles of this, it's a piece of cake. Bows break. They'll continue to break. As long as you make bows, you're going to break a bow. But we're going to show you the rules so you won't break near as many. Simply put, you take a piece of wood, you tie a string at both ends, and bend it, and to an extent, it will throw an arrow. Almost any bow will cast an arrow. As we'll get into later, the arrow is more critical than the bow. But you can make bows that will, some will propel arrows faster and further than others. The idea is to find the combination of wood and technique to enable you to bend that piece of wood to its optimum distance before it breaks. If it breaks, you bend it too far, you've done something wrong. So we're going to show you some rules and principles involved to allow you to go out, cut a tree, cut a limb, shear it, or use it if it's already dead, and make yourself a bow, a stick to shoot arrows. We use a chalkboard here. We're going to illustrate a few points. First, let's show you a tree. Simple, huh? Tree growing in the woods. Bark on the outside, and on many woods on the inside, you have a heartwood. Bark. You have a bark. Exterior bark, you also have an inner bark. 2 layers of bark. The inner bark is what grows a tree. This is a growth ring in the making. Water rises up from the tree through this inner bark. The outer bark keeps the water in the tree. Just below that is what we call sapwood. Sapwood is old inner bark. It's old tree limb, or growth rings. Every year a tree grows, it gets a new growth ring. Bark of a tree. Then you have sapwood, lighter color. Then we'll go into heartwood. On this tree, we have a thin layer of sapwood. Okay, let's grow another tree over here. Bark, sapwood, heartwood. Okay, what we have are 2 different types of trees. This particular type has a very narrow band of sapwood, outer wood, and it has a larger portion of heartwood on the inside. Illustrated here, this is a piece of Osage orange which has been cut. You have individual growth rings, many of them, but you have a very thin layer of white sapwood. Now on this type of wood, most people remove the white sapwood and utilize in its entirety the heartwood, the yellow, utilize that to make the bow. Here's a piece of hickory. a wider piece of sapwood. This is called, generally referred to as a whitewood. This is hickory, elm is one, ash is one. What we're using here to make our bow is the whitewood, the sapwood. We can refer back to that as we go along in our discussion. Let me erase. The tree has grains, not grains as in like grains of sand, but we have individual rings as the tree grows. Each one of those denotes 1 year of growth. As a tree is lengthwise, you have a grain that goes this way. If you split a piece of wood, you put a wedge in and split this, it will split across straight, hopefully, and half of that tree will fall away, split away, and you end up with a half of a log. You can split that again and end up with a quarter of a log, or 4/4. You can split this again, right on down the line, depending on the size of the wood. These grains we'll be referring back to regularly. Let's talk about the grain on the growth thread. This grain, let's take this tree here, split it in half, smaller diameter tree, and make a bow out of this portion of our tree. We remove the bark. The bark would be on the outside. Remove that. Scrape it off carefully. Do not cut into this growth ring that runs the entire length of the log. I'll see if I can illustrate this a little bit better. If you're scraping off your bark on the outside here and inadvertently cut through one of these growth rings, you weaken your bow. That is a spot where this stick wants to break. So what we need to do is, if we cut through one of these growth rings, is remove an entire growth ring. You want the back, the outside, the back of this bow in violet. You want one growth ring to run the entire length of this bow, from one end to the other. Around knots. Don't cut them through. You'll weaken the grain. The grain grows around and over knots where tree limbs have been. Leave them there. If you cut through them, you violate this grain on the back. You need to leave this. This is very critical in bow making. The back of the bow needs to be in violet. It needs to be one growth ring from beginning to end, regardless of whether you're using the whitewood or the heartwood. Either way, you need to keep one growth ring the entire length. It's not as hard as it seems to be once you understand what you're doing. You take a stick, cut it out, you remove the bark, you split it in half. Here is your prospective bow. One growth ring, you remove the bark, or the sapwood to retain the heartwood, whatever. You have one growth ring which runs the entire length of this bow. Now if you were to bend this right now, here's an example of a piece of wood that's pretty much the same diameter to hold this. If you bend this, the majority of your bending is happening in the middle, in one spot. That's what happens if you bend a 2x4 or any solid dimension piece of wood, which is your half of a tree limb. If you bend that now, if you're able to, it would bend only in the middle. what we need to do is remove wood out towards the ends, approximately like that. Then, when you bend this, your stresses are equalized. It's thicker here in the center, and it tapers and gets thinner, less mass towards the tips. So that when you bend this, instead of bending in an arc like this severely in the middle, you will end up getting more of a gradual overall bend. If you want to keep a grip in the middle, you leave more material in the middle, eliminate bending there, have your bending be out here towards the ends. But to do that, you have to have less material as you go out. A real big problem with beginning bow makers is to remove too much wood mid-limb or close to the grip. Make too much wood off here, that dictates the whole rest of your bow. This limb has to bend equally. Note, there has to be bend equally over the entire limb. If there's bending in any one spot, really severe, that is where the bow is the weakest. It's going to break. So you remove wood from the belly, underside, not the growth ring side. You remove wood every place except where it bends. You can't glue it back on, so you remove it from where. If you ended up making a bow that bent severely in one spot, like here, you would remove wood here and here, not in this point. No wood removal here. To make it bend more in here and in here. That's tillering. It's called tillering. Making the limbs bend equally. Now, where do you remove wood? You don't remove it from the back of the bow. You can remove some from the sides, and you remove mostly from the belly, the inside of the bow. When you bend a piece of wood, the back, this side, is trying to tear apart. The fibers are trying to rip apart. This side, the belly, the fibers are compressing together, squeezing tight. That's why your back has to be inviolate. If we've cut through a growth ring on the back and we bend it, that's a weak spot. That's where it wants to split and break. Not necessarily that it will, it's just that that will be the first place that it would break. On the inside, the belly, you can violate growth rings because you're not tearing apart, you're pushing together. These two forces are the main effects of what's happening to a bow. When you bend a stick, the back is trying to tear apart, the belly is trying to squeeze together. If you crease a piece of paper, that's an example of the belly trying to squeeze and crease. If it happens to go too soon, you bend it too far, it'll fail here, you'll get a line across here. It's what they call, we refer to as a fret. It can ruin your bow. Okay, another point of physics. Here's the cross section of your bow. This is a bow of a small limb. Here's a cross section of a bow made from a larger diameter tree. Larger tree has more of a flat surface than a smaller tree which has more of a rounded surface. That's what you have to work with. Explain some more physics. The back, as you bend it, is trying to rip apart. The belly is compressing. At the middle point, some point in between, top and bottom, you have a part of the wood that is called the neutral plane. So when you bend this, there are no forces exerting. The forces are the outside and the belly. Outside and the belly. The outside's trying to rip apart, the belly's trying to push together and squeeze and fail. Let's assume at this point, this is true. The midpoint to top point, or to bottom, tension, T, compression, C. Same here. Your forces of tension in the upper half of the bow, you have 100% of all your tension or compression, 100% within this distance. Obvious. That's simple for anybody to figure out. All your tension is on the back part of the bow, all your compression is on the belly part of the bow, it's 100%. All right, what's not so obvious is that in a very small portion of the top, I'm not sure of the exact figures, but, and let's say 10% of the outside of this portion, 30%, plus or minus, 30% or more, actually, of your tension is taking place in 10% of the wood. Think on that for a second. What that's telling us, here we have a very narrow band of wood taking 30% of the tension. It becomes less and less as you reach towards the middle. You take 10% at the bottom, and it might take 5%, I'm guessing. But the majority of your tension or compression is taking place at the smaller outer limits. If you used a wider, rounder piece of wood, you get a flatter back, one growth ring. You take 10% off that flat back. Have 30% of your tension is taking place, and it is spread over a much, much wider surface. This bow with a flatter back has less chance of breaking than this bow, stressed to its maximum limits, because the majority of its stresses is placed over a wider area. That's why you want flat bellies. Regardless of the bow you make, you want flat bellies. You don't want a rounded belly, because you take your compression and you squeeze it into a small area made out of a small limb. It's got a curved back, so it's got a lot of tension taking place in a small area. But the belly is almost perfectly flat the entire distance. So its compression is spread. The biggest portion of the compression is spread over a much, much wider area. This is really, really, really important to understand this bow making. Very critical. You want flat bellies. If you can get bigger pieces of wood and have flatter backs, great. But if you stay within the grain, one growth ring, you can make good functional bows out of rounded pieces of wood. It's not difficult to do. Follow the rules. This bow here is probably 45 pounds. I think it was 47 or 48 on the scale, drawing an arrow almost half of its length. We'll discuss that further. Most self bows, bows made out of one piece of wood, are designed to shoot an arrow half the length of the bow. All right, we've talked tension and compression. Most woods fail under compression before they fail under tension. So, it's more important to have a flat belly. Not all woods. Some woods are weaker on the back and will tear apart, but the majority of your woods will fail under compression first. So that makes things actually a little easier for us bow makers. Now we need to discuss something about moisture content and brittleness of woods. One doesn't necessarily affect the other, but moisture content does affect brittleness of woods. If you get a piece of wood that is too dry and you go to bend it to make a bow, and she'll pop apart. Okay, if you get a piece of wood that is too green and you bend it to make a bow, well, hell, you can make a basket out of it. What happens here is all this moisture has allowed the compression to really compress, and it gets in and it doesn't respond. There's not the response that is necessary. And when you have bent this so severely in one spot like this, it's great for making a basket or a hoop, but for bow making, you've ruined this piece of wood because you have compressed these fibers and ruined them. You cannot uncompress them as if you cannot unfold a sheet of paper and get rid of the fold. The fibers, the cells are crushed forever. Notice the back hasn't torn apart, but the belly has failed. Now, a piece of wood that is dried with a proper amount of moisture in it. Now, this particular type of wood is dogwood. If it dried in the wild, it would rot and it wouldn't retain these qualities. This has been dried in the house under controlled circumstances. So we can bend this considerable and release it. We've got a lot of spring to it. Dogwood does not make one of the better bow woods, but it makes a bow. I've got a couple, 3 dogwood bows around here. It takes a set. When you bend it several times, notice it has retained this bend. That's because of compression. Compression has come in, crushed these fibers, and so now it won't go back straight. Well, we've learned an awful lot so far about what's happening when you make a bow, what you need to do, what you don't need to do. Well and good, but you need a piece of wood to work with. So, we'll talk a little bit about bow stakes. Now, if you go out and you cut a piece of wood down, any time of the year it's got a certain amount of moisture in it. In the winter it has less moisture because the tree's not growing, it's dormant. The moisture in the tree stays in the outside part, underneath the bark. That's where their moisture is coming up and somewhat in the sapwood. If this moisture is allowed to escape too fast, what happens is it checks the end of the log, or splits it. Okay, so we need to stop this. In the winter it's not quite as critical as in the summer because there's not as much moisture to mess with. Alright, this piece of wood here is a piece of ash. It wasn't cut for a bow stave. It would make a nice bow, but it was cut for friends of ours we're going to send them to for pipe stem. And what we did is we sealed the end of this with Elmer's glue. It just sealed it tight. All the moisture is going to come out the ends. See, the bark is holding the moisture in. That's why a tree doesn't leak. You can make birch bark canoes because bark is waterproof. So we sealed the end. What that does is water can seep through. It can leave slowly at its own rate, and there's no cracks or checks at the end of this log. Now, go to another log we cut just this morning. This was cut 4 hours ago. and it's already cracking. Very slightly, but it's already cracking because the moisture's leaving. Alright, another major cause of cracking or checking in wood is when the heartwood and the sapwood are left together in a stake or in a log. There's moisture in both. The heartwood is denser than the sapwood, so the moisture will leave at a different rate than it leaves the sapwood. Because of the different rates of drying, there's stress is created, and so cracks develop. Alright, so if you're going to work, we're going to split this log I just showed you. We're going to split that out here in a minute and show you. We will separate immediately the heart and the sapwood. Take the bark off. Work it down to our predetermined size, and it should dry with no problem. This piece here is a normal bow stake. This we bought from a fellow. It's been bandsawed instead of split. This side has been split. It is straight grain from one end to the other, and the bark has been removed. The darker coloring you see here is the very inner bark that's been left on the log. That little bit doesn't hurt anything. We have not cut through the grain, the outer growth ring. Hickory is one of the woods where it's really, really hard to tell where the growth rings are. This is not checked and split. What it has been done has been taken down to approximately the size of a 2x4. This is basically what we refer to as a bow stake. We have a certain amount of wood to remove yet to turn it into a bow. Now, if you can look down there, you can see that it is reasonably flat and straight. A wide, big, round tree made this stave flat, one growth ring. This bow will make a more secure bow than a smaller diameter one because of the physics we explained and talked about earlier. It's wider and flatter to accept all the stresses. Now hold that camera there because I'm going to show you here the opposite extreme. This is about as ugly a bow as you'll ever find. This is a half of a limb, a tree limb. It's a very small diameter. As much as you see that bent when it is strung, it was bent that far the opposite direction when I cut it. It should have broken. It didn't break. Now this is the Osage orange we spoke of earlier. I took nothing off but the bark. I left the sapwood on. There are people that say you can't make a bow Osage orange and leave the sapwood on, that it splits and it breaks. I made this almost a year ago. I've been oiled with bear grease, and it's just a real nice snappy shooter, about a 55-pound bow. It's one of my favorites because it's so ugly it shouldn't work, but it's just a pretty dandy bow. We're going to show you how to make this kind of bow, but we're going to get a little bit more involved on some of the physics. Alright, we explained how to do this and save these. Now once this stave is reduced to this, if I go out in the woods and I collect a bunch of staves like the big one I just showed you, I'll split them down and get however many bow staves I can get like this. I will separate the heartwood from the sapwood. This is of hickory or ash, elm. On Osage, you keep the heartwood. But I take it to this size. Then I take a piece of string, I tie it around it, and I hang it outdoors in a covered shed. And I let it hang for, two months. I'm going to say 2 to 3, but actually I've done it in like just over a month. Then I bring it in the house where it's drier. And it'll continue to dry at a faster rate, and in another 3 3 weeks at the outside, using no artificial means to dry it, I'm ready to make a bow. There are faster methods of drying wood. We're going to do that here real quick. So, let's take this large bow stave. Long. It's going to be bow stave. What I want to do is determine where my bow is in here. Well, there's more than one. One of the things, or some of the things I'm looking for. Let's take some of this out of the way here so you can see it better. Okay, I want it straight. And it is. Now, it could be curled slightly in one direction. I can work with it. In fact, it will benefit me if it is, because the finished bow will be bent backwards slightly. That is better physics, better for the bow. This doesn't have it, so I can split this any way I want to. So what I'm going to look for are bad spots in the wood. There's a knot here, there's a knot in here somewheres, a little one here. There's kind of a growth here, not really knots. I can work around most of this. So I can almost pick and choose where I want to split this. And I can easily get 2 bows out of this, possibly 4. But let me determine where I want to split it for my best, for sure bow. And I want it to be, what you're viewing, to be my bow. That'll be the back of my bow. So I'm going to split this now. Which means I want to start it like right here and split it in 2. Now I'm going to make a beginning of a hole. Maybe I better do this a little bit better for my wedge to fit. And I'm taking a splitting wedge. Oop, went off to one side. Let me correct that while I can. Alright. This can be done. Get my wedge to go right where that knife is. Could use a hatchet instead of my knife, except my hatchet handle's coming apart. Now I've got the start of a split on the other side of that knife. Now, let's see if I can make it follow. Nope, going off the side again. Let me try a different edge. Now we're cooking. Okay, you'll note, besides the log not split and plumb straight down the middle, what I'm doing is putting my wedges close together. It helps me control the splitting process much better than if I was just to put one and then 18 inches later put one. It follows the crack down better. This piece of hickory is a little gnarly, which a lot of hickory is. And because of big knot here, which we'd seen the discrepancy in the outside, and that won't hurt the bows at all, it went off to one side. Okay, so I've got one narrower than one wider. Okay, so what that means is I'm going to make one bow out of the thinner piece. That's the one we're going to make for you right here. And then drop that down. The thicker piece I'll go and split in half, and so I'll get 2 more bow staves out of this one. But we'll leave that for now. We're going to venture on. Now, it's been rumored, ever since I knew anything about making bows, read anything about it, that wood has to be cured and dried slowly for months or years, however long before you can turn it into a bow. And you can't work with kiln dried wood, and they can't work with green wood. There's all these things. Well, Tim Baker, this friend of ours out in California I mentioned earlier, he's done the most exhaustive tests on bow making of anybody I have ever heard or read about. And he's proven factually that you can make woods out of, or bows out of green wood, and you can go to the lumberyard and buy wood and make bows. So don't go believing everything you hear or read. I know that one of the self-proclaimed top primitive technologists in the country called Tim Baker up and chewed him out for not following the old rules, for questioning him. You know, that's the person not to listen to. You can see the white at the bottom is the wood. That's what I do not want to cut through. I'm removing bark. You see the real difference between the outer and the inner bark. If you work at any places it seems to be a knot there, you want to work gently and pull the bark carefully around it instead of cutting through it. Now I know that Paul Comstock back in Ohio, he has a method of loosening this bark by placing it in the shower with boiling hot water for half an hour or so. Our problem is we just don't have a shower. Okay, now we're beginning to see right here where I'm scraping, and that's how I'll end up finishing it. I'm getting into the white wood, the actual back of the trees. Right there is the wood, surrounded by the varying thicknesses of the bark that we're removing. Okay, looking at this secondarily, we had one spot here that made me shorten this bow. Right here my fingers at right now, that's a narrow V. It wouldn't have left enough meat on the finished bow for me to have been able to use that knot and run a straight line down. So what I did is I had to move that in a ways to clear. The red line is the center line of the bow. The blue line is what I'm going to remove to initially. That's my guideline. And then these blue lines here, the first one is the middle of the bow, the other two is about where I'll put my grip. Now I just measure my grip, I put my hand over it, and I leave enough room for my hand and an arrow to rest on it. This is it. You'll see more of this as we go along towards the finer stages. So what I need to do now is remove material. And I start from either side, and I just generally start at the bottom, bite in, start removing. Now, I found no real knots in the limb that should bother me, so I don't have any to work around. If there were knots, like I've mentioned earlier, I would leave the material that grows around the knot in its position. Because if you cut through it, you weaken that. I'm cutting through a knot right down here, but it's outside of the bow, so it's not bothering me at all. Okay, as we work down, say there's a longitudinal grain to this wood, and sometimes it waves, so I want to be kind of careful when I'm going like I am, removing that it doesn't all of a sudden take a desire to go in to where my bow is at, where it's starting to, right down there now. You see, that's the tip of the bow, which I'm going to cut off anyhow, or make thinner, so I'll go ahead and take it down. Which is why I like to have my lines slightly oversized when I start up my roughing stage. I haven't been working on this for 10 minutes since we turned it off last time. And I know some that use bandsaws take it to this stage, and there's nothing wrong with that. I could probably get 2 bows if I did. I just don't work with bandsaws. I don't have electricity, for one thing. Okay, now it's about time for me to go ahead and shorten that. So I'll chop it off, and we'll look at some more aspects of what we're doing. Okay, nice little bow. A little stout yet for a string. Okay, I've got a basic shape to it. I've got a straight line. It waves a little bit, but not enough to hurt. It's almost flat for the entire distance. The fact is, it is flat, pretty much. Very little distortion to it at all. So now I need to determine basically what my shape is going to be. Now, each piece of wood will have its optimum width to thickness. Alright, now, from what I've understood about woods and working with it and studying with bows, where compression and tension come into play, that the thicker that you can make your bow without having it be overstressed, especially by compression, the stronger and faster that bow will be. And there is a real physical law for that. Each piece of wood, now like the other piece of this tree, might have to be either thinner or thicker than this particular one. It just, every piece of wood is different. Even off the same tree, it depends on which side the birds sit, I guess, and sing when the sun rises. I don't know. So I'm making it a little wide to begin with. When I make a bow, I like to get the optimum strength out of it, the most that I can get out of this piece of wood. And when it's too much, and then I can lower it down. Generally, I'm talking anywhere between 50 and 65 or 70 pounds out of a bow this length. That varies quite a bit. I've got one upstairs that's 100 pounds. And I've got probably the ideal thickness and everything on it. Let me explain with the thickness. Mass, which is everything that comprises this bow, everything that's left here, when we're done making it, is mass. That's what makes up the bow. The more mass that there is on the limbs, on the tip, in the string, anywhere on this bow, the more mass there is, it slows it. Even the heavier arrows, the more mass in the arrow slows this. So the more wood that is in your finished product, the more mass, the slower your bow will be to respond. Okay, with the thickness, some woods, hickory being one, need to be a little wider because compression needs to be spread out over a wider area to prevent it from causing the bow to stay bent. Every wood will compress a certain amount when you bend it, some more than others. Hickory is one of them more. Alright, so what we do to compromise for this is we make it wider. We spread that tension over a wider surface, and so it has less tendency to fail. Okay, the wider the bow is, the more mass there is, the more material, because I'm going to give you an equation now, which, when you get serious about bow making, will mean something. If you double the width of a bow, you'll double the strength, everything else being equal. If you double the thickness of a bow, you will increase the strength by 8 times. Okay, bear that in mind. That means a lot. So, the thinner, the narrower I can make the bow, and then it has to be a little bit thicker, not a lot thicker. So if I can take a piece of wood, this particular piece of hickory, and find its best tolerance, whatever it may be, whether it's an inch and a half, 3 inches, whatever it may be, I'll get its best performance. So the narrower I can make this bow, bend it to the degree I need to bend it to send my arrow on its way without it failing to compression. And then the more response I'm going to get from my bow, the faster it will send my arrow. Okay, bear that in mind down the road. I don't know, some of you might pick up on it now, but this, you'll probably have to have several bows under your belt before that means a lot to you. Right now you want to be able to shoot an arrow. This is what's determining right now what I'm doing. Also, reflex. My bow is bent backwards. This is the back of the bow. This is good. Before we're done, it's going to be bent back even further. Because after I bend this, shoot it, it's going to compress some fibers, it's going to take a set. It will bend towards me. So if I have it bent backwards to begin with, when it takes its set, and then the closer to straight it will be, the more energy I'll have stored in that string when I string the bow. Better go to work. Got heartwood here to remove. Now I've got my basic shape. What I'm going to do is I'll narrow it some towards the tips. Maybe a little bit I'll take out here in the grips, but that's not quite yet. First thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to start removing wood from the belly side of the bow until I feel that I'm getting a little bit of give, a little bend. Then I'll go into my semi-final shaping. Well, I'm getting her down pretty close to the semi-finished stage. What I'm doing now is roughing in my grips, making those just a little bit narrower in the bow. Nothing fancy yet. Actually, we don't do anything fancy ever. Alright. We've got a bow. Pretty well whittled out. It's green. Can't bend the green bow. We talked about that earlier. We'll ruin it. What I can do is I can bend it a little bit. This is how I tiller. I'm eyeballing it. Just putting enough pressure on this to see that my limbs are bending evenly. Now they're bending rather stiffly now. And it's green wood. Dry wood will bend harder. So this is the rough shape. Now what we'll do is we're going to tie this down in a position so it can't move, and we're going to allow it to dry, and we'll allow a week or 10 days where we got pretty good humidity, even maybe longer. It doesn't take long once you get the bow to this size for it to lose its existing moisture. You want it down, anywhere from 9 to 12% moisture, whatever that means to anybody. I probably started out about 25 or 30. You get too much drier than that, it's too brittle and it'll break. You get too much wetter than 9 to 12, and then it's sloppy. It's just got too much moisture in it. So we're going to tie this in position, and we'll show you as we're doing it. And what we have was we have one tied down that we turned to this shape a week or so ago, and we're going to finish that out. What we've done here is we've taken this green piece of wood that we've shaped into a bow, and we've tied it down into the position that we want it to be in when it is dried. Now, when it dries in this position, with the ears back or the tips back like they are, you can see the reflex that's in the bow. Well, that is going to be in the final product, and this is going to really help us in having a much better shooting bow. Whoever drew that line sure messed up. Well, this is that piece of elm. Let that dry in here for a couple weeks. It sure took a wart. What we're going to do is we're going to correct that. You can see we've got good shape this way to it. This is perfect. It's got ideal reflex, and it was wide. We're going to end up having to do some trimming away to get it more in line and straight. We won't end up with quite as wide a bow as I really was wanting. It won't be near as bad as this, but what we have now is a dry stave. I could put a string on this if it was tillered properly, bent the way it was supposed to, and shoot it right now without hurting anything. This is a done bow. This is what we've been working on, what we tied down over there. It's ready to go. So let's finish her out. First thing I need to do, which I didn't expect to have to do, is I need to straighten it. Now I could heat this and do some straightening, but heating and straightening sideways doesn't work really well. It does, you correct some out of it, and we probably will. Heating and bending this way is no problem at all. But heating and bending sideways this way, then you start getting in some troubles. It doesn't seem to want to hold. So what we'll do is we'll straighten her out as much as we can by removing materials from the sides where there's too much, without making the bow too weak, and then I'll correct it by heating it and straightening it. Now, the tips won't have bending. These won't bend very much, if at all. Otherwise, you just get a real whip bend to the bow. And I have to put a grip in yet. I haven't done that. Don't even know where the middle's at. It's got to be around in here someplace. And we'll work her down. We have to remember, I can remove a lot of material sideways without weakening the bow too much. I have to remove half of this material widthwise in order to cut the weight of the bow in half. But when it comes to thickness, I've got to be a little cautious removing material now, because a little bit removed removes a lot of strength off the bow. So I'll start out eyeballing, trying to straighten it. And I'm going to work slowly to this knife, and you'll see that I'll end up doing a lot of work with a rasp. It's an old horseshoe rasp. And when I get down to more final work and clean work, We'll end up using that. You got a rough side. We'll go to the finer side, and we'll end up doing our final work by scraping. But we're a little ways from that yet, so bear with us. It's amazing how much can get done with rasp control. Now, we spoke of grain earlier, running lengthwise on the bow, and this really runs straight grain from this tip to that tip, but as you noticed earlier, it's going in a roundabout way to do it now. It wasn't that way when I tied it down. It kind of got away from me. I'm doing a pretty good job of correcting it. I brought it in here, I brought it in here. These were the two sides that were warping out, and I may even bring them a little bit more yet. Now this is good because I want narrow tips, because more weight here on the tip of the bow, the more mass or more weight will slow the action down more so than the weight here in the mid-lip. Out here is moving further and faster. So I want this, and fortunately I've got enough thickness here. Remember, 8 times the strength, so that I can go ahead and I can make this pretty darn thin. As long as I'm able to keep pretty good thickness here in mid-limb, I think I'll be alright. Now, elm has a tendency to fail under compression, similar to hickory. I understand. This is my first attempt at an elm bow. I've read some on it. But now, as I look down it, I have a lot to remove along this edge, right in here. Well, my grip will be here in the center. I'll take care of some. And then I'll have to bring it in and eyeball it. But I'm going to end up pretty close to straight. Now, I talked about this longitudinal grain, and it needs to run pretty much straight. It can run out in spots a little bit. That doesn't hurt, as long as the whole bow doesn't cross. If that crosses out, there's a real weak spot, it'll break. One thing you need to be careful, especially when you're working with a knife on this longitudinal grain, is if you're chopping down this way, and that grain is going into the wood, into the bow, you're going to be right in the middle of your bow before you know it, and you've got a problem. I want you to note that we're getting thinning down on the tillering side here a bit, but what I want to point out is we corrected a lot of the curvature that was in the bow. We built a fire over there, and we are going to heat right in this point here where she bends more severely, and bend that back somewhat. This is good because it'll give you an idea of how to heat and bend. But now that I'm starting to tiller, I've got my rough outline of the bow. Now I'm starting to tiller. What I'm doing is for my grip area to be pretty much immovable for this long of a bow. On short bows I like movement in the grip, but on this long a bow, no. Now here, on either side of the grip where my hands are at, will be the thickest spot of the bow besides the grip. The limbs will be not necessarily wider, which they will be wider, but they will be thicker. So what I'm doing is I'm going and I'm removing material up. Now most people, most students, most first-time bowers make their mistake by going too deep in this area, and one side or the other, and that dictates the whole bow. Once you get thin here, it's got to be thinner here. So if you make it thin here, then you have to proportionately thin it towards the ends to keep the limbs bending, and you end up with a lighter weight bow. So what I'm doing with what we have here is I'm taking it down to whatever thickness I have after I get through any depressions that I might have, any dig outs. And then I'll follow and thin all the way out until I reach close to the tips, and then I'll let that remain semi-stiff. I don't want that to actually bend too much. And as I'm working, I use this guide, this line here guides me. That shows me how thick I'm starting, so I want it thinner as I go. I don't want it thinner here than here. Okay, I'll be trimming off and removing material. Now, by following that line, which follows the back of the bow, that will mean, since my bow line may be wavy, the belly line will also be wavy. That doesn't make any difference. If I made that completely flat from one end to the other, it's going to be thick in spots, thin in others, and you won't be able to tiller it. Pretty simple. Okay, I'm going to bend this, attempt to bend it right here. So I'm preheating it a little bit, then I'm going to apply bear grease to it. This is our polyunsaturated bear grease. Real bear grease would have a tendency to catch on fire. This is add some moisture to the wood and help me from preventing to scorch it. I could use water. I could boil this. There's many ways of steaming a bow to bend it. I have always used open heat. I think one time I boiled the tip of a bow. Okay, now the secret here is to not overheat. If you get it real hot, drive out too much of the natural moisture, the wood will become too brittle. So I'm heating gently, moving it, constantly moving it. But I have a pretty thick piece here. It's going to take me a few minutes to do this, but from here to here, not one sharp area, I'm going to try to make a gradual bend. If I see it begin to scorch, and then I know I'm starting to get in trouble. So far I haven't. I've never ever ruined a bow by doing this. You just have to be cautious and go easy and slow. Have some patience. And I'm pretty short on patience. And then as I feel it's getting hot, I'll listen to it, and when it really starts getting warm enough, you can actually hear it sizzling. It'll probably take me a couple times through to do this. It's sizzling now. I can hear it sizzle. You can't hear it. Alright, now I'm going to walk over. Now this is my third trip over here. The second trip took out considerable. I'm holding this over a little while. You don't have to really hold it for a long time. Now, you can see I've really improved it a lot. Not anything really magical. And it really wouldn't hurt me to do one more bend, like possibly right in here, if I wanted perfection. We've reached a point with our rasping now where our tillering is starting to get pretty close. The bow's bending pretty good, and the limb's bending pretty much overall where we need it. From the grip out, if I ever can find the grip. I see that right up in here there's very little bending. So what I'll do now is I'll take my big old Greedo chopping knife and I'll do some scraping. And now remember, this is my finishing work. I little bit off on the thickness means a whole lot of strength and bending. So what I do is I take a little bit, and I'm striving to keep this belly flat for reasons which we've already explained. Now I'll see how my tillering is going. I'm starting to get more bending in here. What I want is bending every place but right in the grip. Where my hand is at, I guess where my hand is at now is where the grip is. And so I'm getting a pretty good feel for it right now. And pretty quick we'll be putting a string on it and showing you how we do our final tillering down, and then we're ready to shoot. And we cut notches in both ends, and there's really no secret to it. We don't get fancy. We used to replicate and do different things. But right now that's all we need to hold the string. Now we have done tillering roughly over our leg as we worked. And that showed me that I'm awful close to being right, and I was. But now what we have is a tillering board. You'll notice I have a loose string on the bow and two nails here in the center cushioned with rag. And I'll pull this down. I have nails set at every 2 inches down the post until I reach 30 inches from here. Now, I never make a bow take 30-inch arrow, but my wife forced me to put that in. This bow is just over 50 inches long, right at 50 inches, and so it should take an arrow half of its length if I build it right. Now what we're doing is we're pulling this down 1 2-inch notch at a time, stepping back and looking for even bending throughout the limbs. This looks uneven. This area here, this is a knot. It twists at this point. It is not uneven. I watch it carefully as I'm working, and there is working, bending in this. So, what I do is I work on this loose string, I'll pull it another 2 inches. I'll study it, and then I'll spring the bow. Pull it back and forth and watch, where is it bending? More importantly, where is it not bending? If it's bending too much in one area and not in another, I'll remove wood from where it is not bending. Once I can pull this string down loosely, where I have a straight line running from knot to knot, about 6 or 8 inches, I know then I can take the next step and tighten my string. Put on a string just as if I was shooting a bow. Before I reach that point, I want to make sure I have even bending. I look for 2 things: even bending in each individual limb. And then when I put my tight string on, I'll look for the 2 limbs to bend equally compared to each other. Okay, now what we've done is we've tightened our string up. We've strung our bow. Nope, she bends equally throughout. Now it's about the same distance between the string and the bow throughout the limb. There's going to be some discrepancies, especially like in this area where there's a twist or a warp, where there's been a knot. Okay, now what I do is I start pulling this bow further. Now I know where my nails are at that I'm bringing the string to. They're 2-inch increments. So I'm at 12 inches here now, and then I'll look at this. I'll study it. I'll stand back, pull it some more. it looks good, and then I'll go another 2 inches. Each time studying carefully. You do need to be make sure that the point of contact on the nail to the notch is equal on both sides. That helps you to see better. And the bow is in the center at the top. So I'll study, look, bend, pull it down another 2 inches. Look at it. Never pull it further if you see a spot that needs work. Let's say we saw a spot on one limb over here. It's not bending. All right. What we do is we take this down, slacken the string, bring it down, whatever scraping device, and then scrape just a little bit. Now I'm not scraping too much here because the bow is basically finished tillered. I'm trying to illustrate for you. So I'll remove a little bit. Work the bow in that spot to reset those fibers, because what we've done is we've removed the compressed fibers at the extreme outside. So we need now to recompress. So I'll bend it over my knee. I'll bend it by drawing it. Then I'll place it back up on the tillering board. Hold it. Settle those fibers in. And bring it to the nail. And then I'll look. Is it bending there? Okay, it is now. And this is what we will continue all the way down until we reach the point of draw that we feel comfortable with that the bow will take. Now I need to determine how long I want to draw this bow. Use a tape measure, which I do normally. But what I'm going to do is use an arrow, one of my longer arrows. I'm going to measure to the center of the bow. Alright, well that comes to this point on the arrow. I'm going to measure down. Alright, that brings me up 3 nails from the bottom. 30, 28, 26. But I'm a little leery. I think I'll try to see if I can pull it to 24 if it feels good. And then possibly after I shot it for a while and it feels good, I might extend the pull further. So, this is how I'm determining how far I want to pull this arrow. Let's see what happens. Gently. Study the bow. How does it feel? Is it going to break on me? Set it on one nail. Look at it. Again, take her down. One more nail. Study it. How is it bending? We're not working with factory material, so everything's not going to be perfect. We have to study each individual piece, what we're working with. There's the big test right there. It's almost 2 to 1. It's within a half an inch of 2 to 1 draw. It takes that. I'm comfortable with it. Still got spring in it. Now, one thing I'm going to do while I'm here is I'll test and see how strong this bow is. I have a spring scale here. Right now I've got a 40-pound bow drawing a 25-inch arrow, 24-inch arrow, excuse me. Yeah, a little bit weaker than what I'd hoped for when I started, but plenty sufficient for blinking around. It would be if it was legal to take for deer hunting. It would be powerful enough, but most states require a 45-pound pull. This is comfortable. I want to mention one thing before we go and shoot this. Well, I got to show you some finishing touches, but this concept of working with green wood, I first learned from our friend Jim Riggs in Oregon. He's taught this for several years in what he calls his quickie bow, where he takes real small diameter limbs and has his students turn them out in just a couple hours time into rough shapes, ties them down like what we do, and 2 or 3 days later they come and they string them up and they utilize them. Now generally the way he's been making they were quickie bows. It's just what he titled them. I watched the concept and I thought, no, why can't you do permanent bows that way? Finished bows, not quickie bows. Well, this is what we've done. We've made a finished bow using that method. We've got several others in the house. We've tested it, and we've got them shooting up to 60 and 65 pounds. You can make a finished bow using green wood within a week from the time you cut the tree, following the method we've shown here. So now I want to go and show you some final finishing touches before we run off and shoot it. We have a couple just little finishing projects I'd like to show you as we're going here. One is use a knife or a stone flake, whichever, and I do some final scraping wherever it's required overall. Smooth it down. You can sand some if you wish. We don't finish bows here. We don't make them pretty. We make them functional. We take them to this stage here, and then we use them. And they don't break any sooner than ones that have a snake skin on the back or whatever they may want done. Now, on the belly of the bow, it's all been scraped, smoothed down, and it's flat going across. We discussed that earlier. We've worked hard to retain a flat. And the shape should basically follow the shape of the outside as it waves. All right, one final step, and this is another tip we picked up here and there. This one comes from Paul Comstock in Ohio, is burnishing down the back. Compress the fibers tightly and get serious about it. Really push in. We haven't violated the grains on the back. According to Paul, who has currently run some tests on it, you can pretty well guarantee yourself an inch or two extra draw without tearing the fibers apart by really compressing them down. So I do it. It kind of really polishes the back up. Note this knot here. The only knot of importance on this bow. Notice that I've let the material remain around it. I haven't cut through it. The fibers grow around it. If I were to cut through that, I'd weaken it, and that would be a weak spot, a good site for it to break. There's a smaller one up towards the tip, and it's in the center of the bow. Again, it's got a raised knob on top. We just leave it as it is. Strings, nothing important on strings. We'll discuss those. It's been discussed in cordage, tape on cordage. We use mostly natural fiber strings. Sinew is a common one. Now that makes the strongest one. Plant fibers, most of them won't hold up to the stresses of a heavyweight bow. Now for general shooting and testing and stuff, we use what we have here, which is just a linen thread, which we buy by the spoolful or have given to us by the spoolful. And then it's in strands, and then we make this 6 or 8 strands thick, whatever it is, and cord it down to make our bowstring. I have a bowline knot tied at one end. I don't know if you're familiar with the bowline, any book will show you. It creates a loop which does not slip, and that will slide just over your knot. The other end of the bow, I just bring around once my line underneath to take up my tension when I'm pulling it, and then as I get it tight to the strength I need, and then I wrap it again, and then I double half hitch, just like I'm tying a knot in my shoe. This is how I do all my bows. Nothing really special about tying knots. Now I want to mention, before we go and shoot this, what we've shown you here using green wood The same methods are applicable if you use a cured out bow stave. It's just a cured stave requires more effort in drying them. Well, maybe you can buy your staves instead of drying them or cutting them green, whatever. But if you have a dry stave to work with, the rules are the same. And if you have to do some heating and bending to straighten, you've been shown an example of that. I think now we should just string our bow up and pick up an arrow and let's go see what it does. Alright, we've made a pretty good bow. We need an arrow to shoot out of it. We've got 12 minutes left on this tape to show you how to make one. So we're going to talk fast, you listen fast. Alright. Many woods can be used for arrow shafts. The best that we have around here, and we found none that is better, some that are comparable, is dogwood. These are some shafts that we have cut for various sizes because we use different size arrows. One of the qualities you look for when you're cutting a shaft is basically straight. None are ever completely straight, but you try to stay away from sudden kinks, real bad kinks. These we can straighten. Once you decide which shaft, well, first off, you have to cure them. You can use green shafts to make arrows, but there's a whole different process. We cut these, let them cure anyhow for 4 weeks, and leave the bark on. And we generally cut them in the fall. I don't know if it makes any difference. All right. Once you determine which arrow you want, what we do is take a knife, a blade of stone, scrape. This is oversized. I'd rather work usually with oversized shaft, reduce it down. You'll see as we go, we got a little nub in here, and as we go along, I'm going to be putting pinch marks in it. I can remove those and then end up with a small diameter arrow that's what I'm after. Okay, let me show you. Here, this is an arrow that has been scraped from one end to the other. And it's ready now to be taken, and we need to straighten it. We scraped it, but she's got her crooks. So let's go find some way and straighten them out. Okay. We utilize for heat to straighten the arrow, which localizes it well, a lamp often. Since we don't have electricity, we have a lot of lamps. Open fires work great. You want coals. This is the tool that you're going to use. It could be bone, it could be wood. This is a split piece of antler, and it just works really well. It's a wrench. One end is a wrench and the other end is a sizer. If we get down to making arrows that match up real good, we want them sized right. It's very difficult to learn to straighten an arrow. There's only one way I know of to tell you, and it's the most successful way I know of straightening an arrow, and it's the most successful way I know of teaching it. Okay. First, you have nodes, as I had mentioned, and you're going to have to straighten anyhow at each node. It'll be bent. But it will also be bent at one or two places between nodes. So let me get back here where I can look down at the same time you can. Okay, right here needs straightening. It doesn't take a lot of heat to loosen the fibers. I do not use grease on my arrows anymore. I used to. Figure out which way I've got to bend it. Take my wrench and bend. What I have now is the first 2 inches of the arrow is straight. That is my guideline. From there all the way up, this first 2 inches of straightness is my guideline. So I'll look off of that and determine where my next crook is. It's going to be just behind the node, right there. So we'll heat at that point. The node is oversized here right now. It could be rasped down, it could be sliced down. We'll show you another way. Heat it. Find out where it needs to be straightened. Place your tool there and straighten. Study where we've done it. Turn it. Okay, the next one is right here. We go to point number 3. We continue this all the way down the arrow until, here's an example of a shaft that is straightened until my fingers. Watch how I rotate the arrow. The shaft to that point is straight. At that point it goes off. And when it goes off, let me turn it and show you, it's got all those little crinkly crooks. We have to get them out. Okay, let's head on to step number whatever. Okay, we're going to continue back with the half straight arrow to show you what we need to do. And down there. Alright. From this point down is semi-straight. We can turn this into a dowel-like object by sanding between these blocks. We have sandstone, we've used sandstone, Indians use sandstone. We'll use those blocks in sandpaper with a groove in between. We'll place the sandpaper, the shaft, the other side of the block, turn it around. And what we're going to do is run this through the shaft. Now you can do this by holding it in your hand this way, or you can also place just a half of a block on top of your shaft and rotate it as you sand. This is what sanding will do. Alright, we've got our shaft. We've got more work to do. One, we have to blunt one end. I'll show you 2 ways to cut notches. One is I go around, all the way around the shaft, score it, like so. And then you can simply break it off. There's several ways to cut notches once you're at this stage. One of the best that I have found is to use a stone blade and saw. You can, of course, use a saw, you can use a pocket knife, but this gives me what I'm looking for, which is that. A round notch to hold the string. Now also, you can put this notch in the way I'm going to illustrate here at the other end of the arrow. Notice I've cut a pair of notches, top and bottom, and I've cut another pair of notches down from it, almost a half an inch. Now this is a trick of breaking out a notch that we learned from Larry Dean Olson, who's been in survival forever. Okay. The red that I've illustrated in is what I am going to break out. That's the hole or the notch I'm going to leave behind. By having cut those notches in, if I apply my pressures just right, I can split that down. The second notch, the one on your right, that notch is to stop my split. Once I have that, then with slight pressure one direction, slight pressure the next direction, back again, you can break out your notch. Very, very slick. You can do this. This is the end that we're going to put our point. Now you can do this at the other end where you put your string, but you want to be sure to reinforce it with sinew because it could split out. Alright, here we've broken the notch out previously. You note we sized the notch for the point. You can predict that. You can predict whatever it is you want to do with it. Now that's what we're going to do at this point. We're going to attach our arrowhead. First thing I want to do is take some hide glue out of my coffee. It's been soaking. And put a little dollop on the end of my arrowhead. Seep that into the arrow. Now, I need to look down and see if it's straight. And make it straight. The shaft. Pretty good. Next step. Let's take some sinew. Tendon. Secure the arrowhead. Easy to go behind the point a couple of lashes, up around the point. I'm not applying a lot of pressure right now because it can pull my point off where it's at. Sinew will dry, or shrink as it dries. Obviously it'll dry. I'll go down below it. Maybe back, up, and down. And now I'm going to rotate up the shaft. This is helping to prevent the shaft from splitting. When this arrow hits something. Alright. Now, sinew will generally lay by itself because of its inherent glue properties. I also like to put a little dollop of hide glue over the whole thing. Now let's double check. See that my point stayed straight. It did. Okay. Now, let's go to feathers. We need to put something on the other end of the arrow. There's a tail feather on the right and a wing feather on the left. We're going to use, and you can use either. We generally use the wing feathers because they are a little bit more straight than the wing feather. So, the way I prepare, move all my junk around here. My feather. Is to pound the quill up. One end to the other. Take my knife. Where's my knife? Take the one I don't want to use. put it between the quill and then almost drive the knife into your platform, your table, your box. And then you have a tendency after you're pounding to pull it most of the way, if not all of the way, up the vein of the feather. Sometimes you play a little bit with it. And we end with 2 halves of a feather. We'll use 1. Okay. Now, what we need to do with this is figure out how long we want our feathers to be. Clean them up. You can see the vein gets thicker here. We utilize the vein when we make our arrows. You can shave off parts of this. Being gentle. And we do a lot of sanding by laying it down and pulling along this way. You don't destroy the feather. What you do is you flatten the quill. We try to get 3 feathers per side. So I use 1 as a pattern. You can see why I wanted my other knife. Okay, let's take 1 of these. We'll prepare it. I like my feather to be approximately, an inch or so long. I don't like too much. I used to make them real long. They can be long. The purpose of the feather is to keep the back end of the arrow from passing the front end. Set that here just a second. Use my knife. Okay. Now what I do to trim it to height, I like approximately a 3/8 inch, 1/4 to half, anywhere in between. I just take my sharp blade, pull it down that way, and I have 1 fletching, 1 feather. Now I need to make sure it stands upright straight. It doesn't here. Stands at an angle. So what I need to do is carve down the high side with either my knife or utilizing sandpaper. And what you want is that feather to set up straight. I'll show you one in a moment. Here are the 3 prepared that we're going to put on the arrow. All from the same side with 1 feather. Now, of course, a trick is to attach them to the arrow. Now we'll have to shift positions. Put these veins on. One at a time. You've got 3. You can put as few as 2. And this is where you wished you had several extra hands. On the upper part, I lash it around once. I need to get first vein pretty much parallel to my notch, my string. The second vein will be off at an angle about like so. And now getting my third one in, talk about all thumbs. Go around, wrap it. This really is not as bad to do as what it appears if you've done several. It's tough to do when I'm trying to show you on camera. At the same time I'm trying to look and see what I'm doing. It's pretty close. Now I'm going to wrap this with my sinew thread. Possibly. You have to get underneath feathers that are coming up. Now what I need to look for is to ensure that my upright feather, which we call the cock feather, is straight above my notch. Not bad. And my other two are equal distances off. As I say, the sinew will shrink as it dries and hardens. Now we need to do the bottom part of that. Grab another sinew thread. Bottom portion of the fletching, the veins, if you can notice as I rotate this, they've been thinned with a knife blade and smashed. I've pounded them. These are the part of the feathers that fly over your hand and the bow. So you want that as snug to the shaft as possible. So you know I did not go under any of those feathers. I went over the top of them so that there's nothing between the shaft and me. I'm trying to use my thumbnail to push these to what looks like straight. Once you get it too tight, you can't do it. I've still got quite a bit of looseness. Okay, let's take a look. You can take a look. Feathers are pretty well where we want them. Alright, let me continue wrapping. Get these little veins out of my way. Now I'm wrapping carefully here. I want a smooth transition at this point because this is where the arrow leaves the bow, brushing against your hand and the side of the bow. If you have any great big bumps here, it's going to catch. You want this smooth as you can get it. Finish it off. Put a dab of hide glue there. Run it around. Put a dab of hide glue up above. Wrap it around. And the fletching is done. Fletching is completed. Now I could, and often do, glue down the fletchings. A lot of times when it gets humid, they'll bow. Well, I learned a good trick from Jim Ham, watching his video on this. If you apply the fletching on a very humid day, and then it'll lay flat when it's humid. And so you've got that problem taken care of. I want to take a moment right here to thank, hold on, thank two people who have really been responsible for teaching me what I know about bows over the last 2 years. I thought I knew a lot before. Jeff Schmidt, who's a professor of physics up in Wisconsin, he got to making a bunch of Asiatic bows a couple of years back, and he's probably shooting 5 of them now, and he's got 3 or 4 more in the works, and he's really taught me a whole lot of physics on the part of making bows. And Tim Baker of Oakland, California has been the other biggest influence as far as teaching Barry and I what we're doing with bows. The man's just magic with bows. Okay, we're going to make a quick bow. This is just simply a limb, bottom limb off a live cedar tree, but the limb itself was dead. It had no greenery on it whatsoever. You don't want to use green wood. It responds too slow. We just discussed that. You want to use dry wood. This isn't so dry, it's rotted. You bend it, it's got spring back. Now, what do they say? Bend it the opposite. So when I would be looking at this bow, or this stick to make a bow, I would think about from here down to here, probably about as much as you can see in the camera, is what I would like to use to make a bow. Now to get it to bend equally, I probably remove a little bit right in here, but an awful lot here at the thicker end. Let's see what I've done. Haha! Almost identical piece of wood. It was bent the opposite way when I started. But having worked with it, and pillared it, I've got it to come back almost to a straight. If I had made this bow following a natural bend otherwise, it would now be bent. All I've done is remove a considerable portion of wood from the thicker end of the stick. I've thinned it considerably so it's thinner here than it is here. This limb didn't taper quite as much as I'd like it to, so I thinned a little bit here. So it also bends a bit more. So it is thinner here than it is here. What we're looking for in a bow. It took me 10 minutes or less to make this. Tim makes finished bows in 9. Another concept I learned from Tim Baker is take several small sticks and put them together. Large end, small end, and then one that's pretty much even diameter for the full distance. Let me turn these around so that we're getting pretty equal over the whole length. She thins as she goes out. Bend them backwards, tie them together, lash them together with a piece of string, bend them backwards, and we would have a bow. I did make a bow like this. There's 4 pieces of wood in here. 2 that go the whole length, 1 that goes about 3/4 of the length, and then a shorter piece towards the grip. And when I bend this, I have pretty evenly bent. Now the proof is in the pudding. So, let's go over and shoot a couple arrows and see what this does. Okay, a little lightweight bow maybe. Or rabbit hunting with it anytime. take a deer.